Students, we're going to go over how to count sig figs in this video. So we're going to pick up where we left off on the last one. Make sure you have written these notes down before continuing. So if you have not written these down, pause the video, write these down, and then start back up to listen. All right, so when we are counting sig figs, this is going to be important because every calculation that we do in class is going to have to use and be calculated to the correct number of significant digits. So we have to know how to count sig figs so we know how to apply those calculations that we're going to go over next week and round to the appropriate number of sig figs. So when we're counting sig figs, what I want you to do is I want you to picture the United States of America. I want you to picture the United States here. I want you to picture that the Pacific Ocean is on the left side of the United States and the Atlantic Ocean is on the right side of the United States. The P, Pacific, is going to represent a present decimal point, and the A, Atlantic, is going to represent the absent decimal point. Rule number 1 here is going to be the most important rule to follow because rules 2 and 3 are going to be the same. Rule 1 changes based on if there's a decimal point present or if the decimal point is absent. So what I want to look at here is if the decimal point is absent, there's no decimal point, we're going to start counting on the Atlantic side of the number, which is on the right side of the number. But if the decimal point is present, I want you to picture the United States, picture that Pacific Ocean on the left side, and we're going to start counting on the left side. So rule number 1 is most important because you need to know and make sure that you're starting to count on the correct side of the number. 2 and 3 are the same for both. You go to your first non-zero number, you start counting, and you keep counting. So in the first example here, we start counting on the right side, the Atlantic side. We go to our first non-zero, we start counting and keep counting. So this number has 5 significant digits. This next example, the decimal point is present, so we're going to start counting on the Pacific side. We go to our first non-zero, we start counting, and we keep counting. So this one has 6 significant figures. Now, why is this 0 significant? Well, it's significant because the measuring device that recorded this measurement was able to give us to that degree of precision. That's why it's based off of. So let's take a look at something else here. Let's say we have 0.0000000000810. Because there's a decimal point present, we start counting from the left, from this side. You go to your first non-zero, you start counting and you keep counting. So this one has 3 sig figs, all right? Whereas if we had 810,000 million, billion, trillion, you start counting from this side, the Atlantic side, the right side, because there's no decimal point present. You go to your first non-zero, you start counting and keep counting. So there's only 2 sig figs in this value. Okay, so let's see how this works. Let's practice. Now all of these examples have decimal points. So that means for all of these, we would start counting from the left. So it's important to figure out which side to start counting on. You always go to your first non-zero, you start counting and keep counting. You go to your first non-zero, start counting, keep counting. Go to your first non-zero, start counting, keep counting. Go to your first non-zero, start counting, keep counting. Okay, so that means for our sig figs, we have 3 sig figs for the first one, 4 for the second, 5 for the third, and then 4 sig figs for that last one. This 0 is significant because we started counting and kept counting starting from the left side. With our next example, these ones are without a decimal point. So when it doesn't have a decimal point, the decimal point is absent, we're going to start counting from the right side. So we're going to start counting from this side for all of our examples. Remember, we're going to go to our first non-zero from this side, start counting and keep counting. We go to our first non-zero from the right, start counting, keep counting. First non-zero, start counting, keep counting. First non-zero, start counting, keep counting. So we had 3 sig figs for the first number, 2 for the second, 5 for the third one, and 3 sig figs for that last question. This 0 is just a placeholder. It is not significant. So why don't you try these examples on your own first, pause the video, try these examples, and then check your work against mine. So what I would suggest, again, look to see if you're starting counting from the left side or the right side. So no decimal means I start from this side. I go to my first non-zero, start counting, and keep counting. So this one has 5 sig figs. This one has a decimal point, so I start from this side. I go to my first is non-zero, start counting, and keep counting. This one has 5 sig figs. The next example has a decimal point, so I start counting from the left. I go to my first non-zero, start counting, keep counting. So I have 3 sig figs here. Here, there's no decimal point, so I'm going to start counting from this side. Go to my first non-zero, start counting, keep counting. So I have 1 sig fig here. Decimal point means I start counting from the left. I go to my first non-zero, start counting, keep counting. I have 5 sig figs. And then my last example, no decimal point. I start counting from the right, start counting, keep counting, and I have 2 sig figs. So let me know if you guys have any questions about counting sig figs. I'll be happy to help, and good luck.